Welcome back to Actually Useful, the show where we diagnose what's wrong with the internet and we chat with the good folks who are trying to fix it. How you doing, Josh?
I am very excited for today's episode because I'm just filled with like a manic rage to talk about today's topic. So I'm ready. How are you?
Hell yeah, I'm good. I'm excited to wrap up. We've been working on private equity for like months now and taking all these notes and reading all these sources. So I guess I'm excited to like share our conspiracy theories with the world. But first, you have some news, don't you?
Yeah, so 404, who we love, 404 Media, has been doing some great reporting on this emerging AI engine optimization that's happening, AEO. It follows kind of similar like shitty practices from SEO, search engine optimization, in that you're trying to get a giant algorithm to recommend your product. But the difference here is that because AI scrapes so much from user-generated content, UGC websites like Reddit and Wikipedia, there's now this mass influx of users like editing Wikipedia articles and posting on Reddit, like just hawking their wares to try to trick like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini into recommending those things. So this article talks about this research paper from Cornell that found that messages as short as 13 words were able to change the results of an AI search. So for example, you are looking for Mexican restaurants in Austin, a single 13-word comment on one Reddit chain about Mexican restaurants in Austin, and all of a sudden when you Google Mexican restaurants in Austin, Gemini, Google's AI search engine will recommend that restaurant. A really funny example of this early on in the AI boom was a bunch of League of Legends players got Google to believe that there was a fake League of Legends character out there, and it started talking about like its moveset and all these things. So, I feel like a lot of the time when we cover these things, it's like we're so early in the AI curve that right now a lot of the examples are silly. And it's like, yeah, we're pretty used to like companies pitching themselves, everything being an ad, like, oh, that's funny, it messed this up. But like, I cannot wait personally for when politicians realize this, and like every single Reddit thread about politics is just bots controlled by right-wing grifters. And I'm sure Democrats too, trying to make the argument that you should vote for them. And then when you're doing research on candidates, trying to find out their platform, you're getting all this just astroturfing. So fun stuff as always on Actually Useful.
I saw the news too that Germany is trying to hold Google accountable for incorrect information in their AI overviews, which I don't think will go through, but I do think will be an interesting legislative process. I guess I didn't realize until recently a lot of judges like live stream their courtroom the whole day. I don't really know the rules of who gets to do this and who doesn't, but like now there's...
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the courtroom. Today we're deciding a custody battle.
But they're like kind of professional about it, but that means that there's now these supercuts of like idiot lawyers with the judge being like, hey, so you cited a case in your case notes that it doesn't exist. Like, where'd you get that from? And they're never like, ooh, I might have used AI. They're always trying to be like, I don't know where that came from. And I saw one where she was like, so actually the case law that you're citing in this is not only does it not exist, it's actually contrary to actual law. And that's what you're using in your defense today. So I do think it's nice to be able to see stupid people figure out they're stupid, but it gets a little too dangerous when the stupids are in charge, which brings us back to our topic of the day.
Great transition. The stupids being in charge.
Just a quick note before we get into today's episode. It is time for our semi-annual break. Josh and I have some summer plans and jury duty, so we won't be releasing an episode on July 30th. We will be back to our regular schedule on August 13th. Okay, back to the show.
So today's topic, this is going to be part 2 of our conversation about private equity. And before we dive in, I was thinking about this, Ariel, and I was like, I feel like most Americans have this vague sense that like there are companies that influence politics. There are corporations that, you know, basically puppeteer certain congresspeople and affect the laws that get passed. Like that's just a very intuitive observation about democracy in late stage capitalism. But we really want to get specific here about exactly who is doing this puppeteering and this lobbying to control these things that affect, you know, all our day-to-day lives. And the big bad we're going to be talking about today is private equity. You know, we have a few villains on this show. Like we talk about big tech, we talk about venture capital, we're talking now about private equity, but not to be like glazing the other two, but like at least tech makes things. Like at least venture capital like invests in new companies to try and like, you know, grow into new businesses. Private equity does none of that. It is purely parasitic. It really just dives in to existing companies, bleeds them dry of all their resources, and just like discards the empty husk into the nearest back alley. It's like a truly disgusting industry. And this is why we have a lot of the problems we have in our country. I fully believe if you broke up some of these private equity firms, you would get rid of like half the problems we face as a country. So just to give you guys an idea of some of the sourcing we're going to be using for this episode, we're going to be talking about Plunder from Brendan Ballou, Bad Company by Megan Greenwell, and some info from More Perfect Union, who do a lot of great reporting, both on like national politics, local stuff, and also like the financial fuckery that happens behind the scenes. So the basic mechanism of private equity is they buy businesses with the intent to flip them for profit. And if that sounds like just normal capitalism, it's a lot worse than that. They load up companies with debt and do a bunch of convoluted, illogical financial engineering to position themselves to reap a high reward with very little risk on their own end. This is what killed Toys R Us. This is what's fucking over a lot of doctors and hospitals. It's affecting the national government. It's affecting local government. And of course, it's impacting technology, which we're concerned with on this show. There's no real regulation in how they can value their assets. There's not a lot of regulation in general. And this is because there's just kind of a revolving door from people that work in government and people that work in private equity. And so there's not a lot of incentives to regulate this thing because a lot of politicians see private equity as like what they'll do after they retire from politics. So why would you fuck over the companies that are eventually going to be your boss? They're also never ones to waste a good catastrophe. During the financial crisis and the housing collapse, they went in and bought up all these single family homes and started renting them back to people at exorbitant rates. They're a big contributor to the housing crisis we're experiencing today. And they also love just preying on vulnerable populations. We talked about old folks' homes, prisons,
hospitals.
Right. So, Ariel, I'm sure you have some horrific examples today. Do you want to tell me what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah. All right. So I feel like we started with like retail. We went into housing, prisons, nursing homes, like you said, and we're getting more into, you know, I have thought about private equity now for a couple of years. Like as we got into this show, Josh, I feel like I'm just more and more convinced that private equity really does exist to bleed the public dry, and like the relationship between legislators, politicians, and private equity is just like, how can we exploit any money left for public services? So
it's really funny, like Trump gets all this shit for it, which he should. He's like another level of corruption, and it's just so naked and brazen. But a lot of like pundits and politicians are acting like this is the first corruption in U.S. history.
I know.
Like,
well, and I feel like
and
this
it's
is
like,
part of the...
bro, you personally took $50,000 from BlackRock. Like,
I think that's part of why we're in this situation, is that like there's definitely a cognitive dissonance between how bad is Trump, and like in some way we're going full circle of like, yeah, I definitely like since Trump won, and really since Trump too, I've been like, oh shit, it's always been like this. Like it's always Epstein's all the way through this private equity. You'll see like these are bad dudes. So let's get into payday lending. So the thing about payday lending, which is an industry that private equity really enjoys exploiting, it has a lot of their hallmarks. It has a vulnerable population. It has a captive population. They're captive by their debts. And what I think is really interesting about payday lending, which is already a disgusting industry, and it incredibly predatory industry. But what's interesting is that we talked about in the last episode that private equity does not have any specialized expertise. Like, they don't actually offer like management consulting, even though you pay consulting fees. They're not experts in management. They're experts in financial engineering, with the exception of like in payday lending, the product is financial engineering. So this is actually quite in their wheelhouse. So the appeal of payday lending and installment loans, these are sort of like, yeah, the get cash now signs you see, particularly in developing areas. So over 80% of payday loans are renewed or refinanced within 2 weeks. Like, the thing to understand is that these are not situations where somebody suddenly needs cash for, car repairs or something. That might be how it starts, but the majority of the time, payday lending is going to debt. It is going to already existing debt, and you are trying to get it now so that you can like avoid getting evicted or avoid getting your power turned off or something that would be like catastrophic for your family. But it doesn't mean that you're actually like putting the money towards important essentials. You're putting it towards the interest on the loan. So over 80% of payday loans are renewed or refinanced within 2 weeks, and they are called loan sequences. And this is all like an intentional engineering on behalf of not just private equity, but people who, are running payday lending as an industry. The majority of the time, the loans are just paying the interest. The principal is not actually going down. You're just stuck in this endless cycle. And under pressure from private equity overlords, as these like debt collecting companies are getting bought by private equity, the debt collectors who work for them have these higher and higher quotas they need to fill, and they're going to these extreme lengths. They're threatening debtors. They're trying to collect on fake loans. They're showing up at your work. They're showing up at your family. Like, they're harassing you to try to get you to pay down this debt because they get incentivized when you start to pay down your debt. In Plunder, there's this story about a woman named Letitia who gets sent an unexpected check for $2,500 from Mariner Financial. It just showed up in her mailbox. $2,500 was 3 months of income for Letitia, and the terms on the check were to just pay back $100 a month for 3 years, which
this is like one of the worst stories in the whole book. It's like atrocious.
And honestly, you might be listening and being like, why would you sign for $2,500 if you have to pay it back $100 a month for 3 years? Listen, people have to do what they have to do to pay their bills, and like that itself is not necessarily predatory. Like, at least it's straightforward, right? It seemed that way. So she cashed the $2,500 check. She put it towards some important bills she needed to pay. Well, now she's in this cycle. So she set off this, it set off this back and forth where Letitia would fall behind on payments. Mariner would then lend her more money. 95% of the money they lent her would just go to pay themselves back. So she's just getting in deeper and deeper debt. They also would sneak in these payments to like random insurance policies. So they started to imagine every time she signs one of these new loans, there's all these terms and conditions she signs, and they get more and more predatory as she gets more and more desperate. She fell behind enough that Mariner, the financial company, could take her to court. But what she didn't realize is in those terms and conditions, she signed away her right to sue them in court by agreeing that she would pursue claims in private arbitration. And Mariner Financial did not sign the same agreement. So they're allowed to use the state courts to bleed her dry and get back money from her. So if she tried to arbitrate with them, she would be in a private company. So arbitration is a private company that adjudicates a claim. They're paid by the private equity firm. There's basically no outcome where the private equity firm will be found at fault. It's not a real court. It doesn't have neutrality. It's going to a private office and getting someone who works for private equity to agree to terms that are suitable for private equity. And then also, because it's not a real court, it doesn't create legal precedent. It's usually behind a bunch of NDAs still. So if somebody did manage to actually become successful in arbitration and get their claim approved, they couldn't then use the findings that came out in that arbitration process to support anybody else who's in a similar situation. So there's a lot of secrecy around how to even fight private equity. When private equity then sues Letitia back in court, they can charge the debtor for the cost of the private equity's attorneys. They can charge you for the entire court case, essentially. Regulation has been proposed to try to avoid this because it's obviously quite gross. But regulation from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was proposed in 2017, and it was heavily lobbied against by private equity firms. Why is that, Josh? What is it? What is it about the lobbying that appeals to people in Congress?
I think they just like have a passion for like good management.
They love consulting.
So, Ariel, do you think it could have anything to do with the fact that since 1990, the private equity industry has spent $896 million lobbying Congress people?
That sounds right.
I probably has nothing to do with it. Okay, so lest you think that we're just a couple of liberal cucks, we do want to point out that this is a fully bipartisan issue. This is like truly one of the last great bipartisan efforts is to strengthen, not regulate, strengthen the private equity industry. And so this is because of this revolving door that you have with former congresspeople, presidents, chiefs of staff going between government and private equity. This has led to all sorts of problems, tons of money pouring in. The book Plunder talks about how there are 7 tax lobbyists for every member of Congress. So this is like a disgusting amount of money at stake here. It was kind of funny to me, Ariel, reading this book, like how little money it takes to buy off a congressperson.
Oh yeah, that's one of the grossest things too. You look at the money and you're like, $60,000. You did it for $60,000. Like,
yeah. So let's get into one of these examples. Surprise medical billing is something that affects a lot of Americans, and I'm sure if you don't have experience with this, like maybe one of your family members or your friends does, but essentially you are receiving care at a hospital. Maybe it's an emergency situation. You think your insurance is going to cover whatever care you're receiving. And then all of a sudden the hospital tells you like, oh, these specific charges we had to do, these were out of network. This is a common tactic of private equity, the bait and switch, where they have like enshittified all these hospitals and are trying to get as much money out of you as possible. And for a while, there was some real momentum in the government to try to crack down on this. This was something that Obama campaigned on. It was something that had like some amount of bipartisan support. And with spending just a few tens of thousands of dollars here and there, strategically targeting different congresspeople, they got people to essentially flip their vote and weaken any regulation that would get rid of this surprise billing.
And I'll just say that, like, if they're lobbying against surprise billing, that tells you all you need to know, which is that the surprise billing is not an administrative accident. Like, it's not a situation where you just like someone forgot to charge you and it's just like an innocent follow up later and get the bill. Like, clearly the strategy is surprise billing. And so much of where private equity is exploiting people really speaks to the like truism that it's more expensive to be poor than it is to be rich. Like, I had surgery at the end of last year by a private equity owned hospital, and it was obnoxious. It was a terrible experience. Like, everything about it was bad. But when I went to pay the hospital, like, I could pay up front for the surgery. Every single, like, I had to pay the hospital, the anesthesiologist, and my surgeon, and every single one of them took more money from me than they needed. Like, they took more than they actually billed me and then sent me a check later. And I'm like, this is so fundamentally different from most people's experience of medical billing that I'm like, I think I was not lucrative enough to exploit because I could pay up front. So there was no trapping me, you know?
And unfortunately, like, the incentives here are fully aligned because the private equity industry is going to pour money into Congress, and then Congress is going to make sure PE, doesn't have their income stream shut off. One of the most, like, I don't know, just naked examples of this is like how private equity execs like categorize their income. They do this like legal sleight of hand so that technically the money they make qualifies as capital gains instead of income. And I know this sounds boring, but it essentially means that like the CEO of Blackstone, who is getting all this fucking money from fucking over Americans, pays a lower tax rate than you and me on some of this stuff.
By lower tax rate, we mean the difference of like 2 to 4% versus us paying like 25 to 35%. We're talking big differences in proportionality.
Again, this is something that's been like politicians of both parties have attempted to deal with this for a while, or at least campaigned on it. Obama campaigned on this. Even Trump campaigned on this, weirdly. He was like the carried interest loophole, it's been very good to me, but I want to shut it down. Part of his like economic populism message, I guess. But once they get in there, you'll have people like Susan Collins, in the news again today, running for Maine, but essentially come out and say, yeah, let's get rid of this crazy way that private equity execs get around paying their fair share, and we'll use that to fund a child tax credit. Well, the next day and several donations later, you have her Republican colleagues coming out and saying that she's changed her mind and, thinks it would be bad governance to regulate the PE industry. And so you see how quickly and how, tenaciously private equity looks after its own. That guy, that Republican who said that Susan Collins changed her mind, Drew Maloney, he then leaves government to run private equity's largest lobbying arm. Like Steven Schwartzman, the head of Blackstone, paid a super PAC $2 million who is supporting Susan Collins to get her to change her mind on this. So like there is no interior mechanism for reforming private equity. It's really going to have to come from us.
And also, like, Congress is choosing to legislate a certain way. Like, these are examples of Congress making choices in how they legislate. But Congress's job is not just to legislate. Congress also is expected to, like, investigate and oversee things that are happening that are of national importance. Like, part of your congressperson's job is to decide what is of national importance, which is why when things happen that you are really fucking mad about, you should call your congressperson and be like, hey, this is important to me. So we can also see their biases in what they choose not to investigate and how they choose to investigate the things that they are investigating. So there was a story, there's a company called SolarWinds. It's an IT company that makes network monitoring software. So basically it's software for like very large connected internet networks where this software is like observability. So you can see like your performance, like how fast is your internet depending on where you are in, we're talking about like a huge campus, right? Of like that might be one customer. It looks at your performance. It looks at your usage. It looks at your security. It double checks that everything is working with your internet as expected. And there's nothing like unexpected happening on your network. SolarWinds has $230 million in government contracts. They have over 300,000 customers. And in 2016, they were bought by 2 private equity firms. Over the next couple of years, their workforce was slashed. They had repeated mass layoffs. Their software development was moved offshore. And then their strategic focus became not innovating on security, but acquiring competitors, which resulted in the abandonment of the security company's own security. So the company had no formal training for their new employees. They published a password to their update server and they just like left it posted for over a year. And
Can you tell us what the password was, Ariel?
It was SolarWinds 123. That was the password to their like main update server. They're a cybersecurity company. Oh my God.
Private equity is fucking awesome.
These people are stupid.
But so this is like, they pitch themselves as these management geniuses who understand every industry and can come in and streamline it.
I feel like, and you bring up the Enron example too, but like, I feel like this is a thing. I think that they are geniuses. They are geniuses at the work of private equity, which has nothing to do with what they're saying. Like the work is to come in and do this shit and they're really effective at it. Like
the work is wealth extraction.
Yeah, the work is wealth extraction and they're really good at it. And so in 2017, a cybersecurity advisor went to SolarWinds and they were like, hey, you guys are going to have a catastrophic catastrophic national security problem. Like, you guys have a bunch of federal agencies on your network and your fucking password is SolarWinds123. So why don't you fix it? And their private equity overlords were like, that seems really expensive. So they just didn't take any of his advice and he resigned. And then exactly what he said would happen happened. So in 2019, hackers employed by the Russian state embedded malicious code into their compromised update server that had the password SolarWinds123. And the way it worked is that every time a customer would then update their SolarWinds software, along with it would come a Trojan horse virus that got snuck in. And 18,000 customers downloaded the infected software, which basically copied all personal information on their computer over to these Russian agents. Congress did hold hearings. 5 different congressional bodies did have hearings about the incident, but they never included anybody from the private equity firms in any of their questioning. They never even named, like in the congressional record of these trials, they never even named the private equity companies that owned SolarWinds. Like every time they would refer to an accountable body for this problem, the accountable body was SolarWinds. At the same time, some very obvious insider trading happened 6 days before SolarWinds publicized that they had this major cyber attack. $280 million in their stock was sold. Basically, they avoided $100 million in losses by doing a little insider trading. And as we know, insider trading never gets punished.
And again, is a fully bipartisan issue.
Fully bipartisan issue, insider trading.
Maybe that's the other, private equity and insider trading. Those are the two.
Yeah. Anything that can make, politicians rich is a bipartisan recreational activity for sure. Brendan Ballou says that he feels like private equity is just such an unknown entity that Congress genuinely just didn't know that they should be investigating private equity. I personally love Brendan Ballou's work and call absolute bullshit on that because obviously they're in bed with them. Why would they call them if they know that that's who's going to hire them, that that's who's paying them? They're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. So that's why, you continue to see it at every layer of the choices that our Congress people are making, that they're just not interested in holding private equity accountable.
Private equity also would be totally fine just becoming our government and replacing it. Just them and Palantir, just hanging out, spying on citizens, controlling our finances.
That's their dream.
Literally. They're very open about this. There's one private equity exec who said, with the huge funding gap in infrastructure, private equity firms have the opportunity to fund essential assets for providing drinking water, power, roads, and airports. Note the way he describes that as assets, not things humans need to function. So one of these areas is 911 dispatch. There's some PE firms that buy up West Corporation, which is a call center operator. They provide 911 dispatch services. And immediately, there's just a massive drop-off in the quality of services here. There was, in 2014, a 6-hour outage that affected 11 million people. And again, this is your life is threatened and you call 911 and just no one picks up. There was 6,000 calls that were affected. The entire state of Washington was left without a working 911 system. And all of this while the West Corporation has $3 billion of crippling debt caused by private equity. We talked about that a little bit last time, but essentially private equity companies can take out debt to buy a company and then put it on the company's balance sheet. And somehow that's allowed to happen and isn't illegal. Another area has been ambulances. So I didn't actually know this, but in 1988, no city had private ambulance services, which I think is wild considering how expensive they are today. This used to just be a free service by the government. Then by 2012, nearly 40% of cities did have private ambulances. Today, there's a big meme of if I get injured, call me an Uber because I'm not going to go into debt to pay for an ambulance. I mean, 2/3 of bankruptcies in the US are caused by surprise medical care. So this is a huge problem. For firefighting services, there's this story from Plunder where in 2018, this couple in rural Arizona Arizona, their house is burning down. They come home to see a private firefighting company spraying their house down. They didn't call this company, and they're then charged $20,000 for the service of failing to save their house. And then finally, water services. There are towns in Pennsylvania and New Jersey that have sold their water services to private equity. The through line for a lot of this stuff is that private equity has literally thousands of people working on finding these ways of like leveraging and gaming the system. And cities and towns just don't. Like they have public servants who are trying to work in the public sector and do the best they can. But like the best corporate lawyers in the world are always going to beat those teams. And so a few towns in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they sell their water rights. And it turns out that there's this hidden clause where if demand falls below a certain threshold, they get charged these crazy fees. And that threshold was set in a year of very high demand. So naturally, the next year, that demand falls, and then boom, they get hit with all these hidden fees. And this is just a ongoing process where private equity finds these little edges to game out to be able to turn our essential systems into assets for their gain. So like you're literally still paying for these services. Like you're still paying for ambulance services with your taxes. But because of the way these firms extract their fees, like before selling to private equity, you pay $10 in taxes and you get $10 worth of ambulance services, right? That's like wages, truck maintenance, medical supplies, whatever. Then after selling to private equity, you pay those $10 in taxes, and $2 of them go to management fees, $3 go to leasebacks, $5 for medical supplies that used to cost $3 before this private equity partnership forced up the costs of these things. And it all just breaks down.
I think when people think about what a country with substandard healthcare looks like, they might picture a hospital that's like understaffed, understocked, and unsafe because it's in a conflict zone or it's in some like remote location and it's like doesn't have walls or whatever. But like it could also be understaffed because it's private equity owners laid off half the staff, could be understocked because the private equity owners contracted with subpar suppliers so that they'd get a kickback, and unsafe because it's the only hospital left in a 2-hour radius and the average level of staff training just got slashed in half. So like private equity is a huge contributor to the fact that the United States is a third world country with better marketing. Like that's absolutely where we're at here.
Bars.
I didn't come up with that myself, but I will use it.
And then even if you like don't want to support private equity, unfortunately, like you are supporting private equity, and that's because they're tied up in like your 401ks, your pension funds.
Yeah, they're taking our taxes, y'all. It's going right into their pockets. So 88% of pension funds have private equity investments. Now, you listening to this are probably like, I don't have a pension fund. Isn't that a thing of the past? Yes and no. You probably don't have one, but they're not a thing of the past. They are for public employees. So state employees, for the most part, still get pensions. California's pension system, called CalPERS, the California Public Employees Retirement System, is one of the world's largest. In general, pensions are struggling. The reason that they like private equity is that nationwide pension funds are underperforming at $1.5 trillion. Like,
awesome.
I think we all know this story of like the boomers did not do anything to support young people financially. So like we are paying for all the boomers who are currently on pensions, and the mismanagement of our economy certainly hasn't helped. So like I said, CalPERS is the largest pension fund in the country. Makes sense. California, obviously very populated state. CalPERS pays $30 billion a year for 775,000 members. 10% of that money is in private equity. Now, remember, private equity is rarely liquid. So like it is rarely, when we say that an asset is illiquid, essentially what that means is like It's not real cash. And this is where I will not fully digress on this, but I have held firm since I was 16 years old that rich people actually don't have any fucking money, okay? Like, Elon Musk does not have $1 trillion, all right? This money is made up, as evident by the fact that we're saying private equity, like, truly has no regulated value system. Like, they, like, literally just make up the valuations of things. So 10% of CalPERS money, you know, $3 billion that needs to go next year into the pockets of senior citizens that have every right to believe that the pension that they were promised is still going to be supporting them. Like, if next year we're trying to draw on these pensions and we can't because 10% of it is in private equity and we can't get to it in cash, that leaves vulnerable seniors without their income. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about pension funds is that the boards of pension funds include participant representatives that are actual beneficiaries of the fund. So think like retired teachers, civil servants, working class people who are much more likely to be sympathetic to the story of devoted employees being laid off and getting no severance as a result of private equity's mismanagement. So after Toys R Us went bankrupt due to KKR, their private equity owners, mismanagement, some of the affected employees went on this speaking tour and they went to go to talk to pension funds that were invested with KKR. And it worked. In 2018, Minnesota's $93 billion Public Employees Pension Board voted to pause all new investments with KKR because they were disturbed by the stories that the former Toys R Us employees were telling them. And the Washington State Investment Board interrogated KKR executives too, publicly shaming them, publicly exposing the sordid details of how they've exploited their workers. And I will say private equity has actually pulled away from retail investments. Now, optimistically, you could say, is it because they got so much bad press? I do think that that's part of it, but also it's because retail turned out to not be particularly recession proof. And so they're trying to move into areas that have like more captive audiences. And they're still very much in our pension funds.
You thought it was good news, but no, it's bad news.
Yeah, it turns out I don't think private equity cares what we say about them behind their backs. I think that's kind of the thing about them is that like there's nothing you can do that will shame them. And so pensions have been like quite lucrative for private equity. So they're going to go into something that looks a lot like a pension, which is a 401k. So as of today, there probably is not a lot of private equity in your 401k. So this is a breaking news situation. Prior to 2020, private equity was not a big part of 401k at all. It was not illegal for a 401k to invest in private equity, but 401ks are governed by a law called the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA. It wasn't illegal for 401ks to invest in private equity, but private equity did not fit the reporting requirements of ERISA. It's too opaque. So functionally, it meant that if your employer chose a 401k that had a lot of like alternative assets, which are private equity, private credit, and crypto falls into that as well. If your employer chose a 401k portfolio with alternative assets and then the fund underperformed, employees under ERISA would have legal standing to sue their employer. In 2020, the Department of Labor under Trump issued a guidance saying, hey, 401ks, don't you guys want to invest in private equity and crypto? The 401ks were like, is this real? Can we do it? Is this the moment? But it was like late in Trump's presidency. There was not a ton of movement. I think the private equity firms were kind of like, give it a second. Biden immediately came in and said, actually, that's not a very good idea. We should not do that. So he like rescinded the memo that the Department of Labor under Trump had put out about, you know, please put it in alternative assets. But then as everybody who's listening knows, we were then gifted with a second Trump presidency, even bigger than before.
I mean, I voted for him.
Josh, I swear to God. Now, under
guys,
Trump,
I didn't. I need my career.
I think you don't have to specify. I think they know.
There's a lot of gay Trumpers. I hate to tell you.
But you're not one of them. And I think people know that. So under Trump's second term, 401ks are now becoming fair game for private equity. Josh Harris, who's the co-founder of Apollo, one of the biggest private equity firms, like literally he went on an interview and he said of 401ks, he said, this may not go well. Some of these assets may not be liquid when they're needed. But like this guy lobbied for this legislation. Like this guy wants He wants 401ks and private equity to get married. The challenge then, again, going back to, well, what if it's not liquid when we need to withdraw? Like, remember, how private equity works is that they have this pile of companies that they're trying to extract as much value as possible. And sometimes that means that they milk it till it's dead and they bankrupt the company. But for a lot of reasons that we've talked about on this show, it's like people don't want to let a business die anymore. There's the website, there's the brand cachet, there's the debt gets really valuable. So like these things just keep getting recycled. And that has contributed to this problem we talked about in the last episode, which is that private equity is sitting on 32,000 unsold companies, according to Bain Capital. They issued a report.
Is that bad?
Yes, it's bad because supposedly all this value that they're sitting on, if they're going to say these 32,000 companies are all worth $10, because I can't do really complex mental math while I'm recording, that would mean that they then say, we're sitting on $320,000 plus whatever other businesses they have. Well, if no one buys these companies because they're like, that's not worth $10, it's worth $2, actually, then you only have $64,000. You don't have $320,000 because no one would fucking buy it, because you can't just say something is worth a certain amount of money if nobody wants it. Like, that's like the whole thing about money.
This is, I hate to keep beating a dead horse here, but this is literally what Enron did with mark-to-market accounting for oil's futures, is they just said they magically knew how much oil contracts would be worth 10 years down the line and then logged that as profits. So we're running on Enron fumes here.
Yeah, and the scale is similar. I mean, remember last time I said 14% of large banks' loan commitments are to private equity. So we're getting to a point where private equity is supporting as much of the economy as the subprime housing market did in 2008. So like, we're absolutely running headfirst into a situation, into an Enron, into a financial crisis. We've seen this playbook before. After looking at all of this evidence, it really seems like private equity exists to loot and pillage whatever is left of public services. Basically, like, this is a massive redistribution of wealth. So they make money off of services that are either paid for by taxpayers, like public pensions, utility services, 911 dispatch, ambulances, prisons, things that come out of our tax dollars, or they make money off of things that are essential needs: hospitals, nursing homes, housing, news media, 401k plans. Most of that money gets pocketed by the billionaires at the top. A little bit of it is going to go back into the private equity fund to do more fuckery so they can pillage more stuff. And then some of it goes into the political action committees that lobby Congress to further erode social safety nets. And they'll continue doing that, continue further eroding it so that it gives private equity more leverage to go in with their private little claws and dig their claws into things like housing, which again used to be secured by the government. And now Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are in bed with the private equity firms. So like, say goodbye to housing stabilization, whatever's left of it.
Literally talk your shit.
And then eventually, whether it's a Democratic Congress or a Republican Congress, the American people get so fucking fed up and do enough shit that the government goes, fine, here, damn. And they give us something. And then private equity comes in to say, oh, did you fund ambulance services? Great, I'll take that off your hands. I'll run that for you and make a bunch of money. And that's when we get into, is 100% of my taxpayer money going into the services that I'm expected, or are they going back into the pockets of these executives of private equity firms? And also, these guys are bad dudes.
How do you figure?
Bro, like I said, Jeffrey Epstein loved private equity. He loved private equity billionaires. He managed a bunch of their shit. So like, I guarantee you, just like go in there and look up some of these dudes. I will give you a story that Brendan Ballou puts in Plunder. In the lead up to the 2012 election, Mitt Romney said 47% of people will vote for Obama no matter what, because they believe the government has a responsibility to care for them. They believe that they're entitled to health care, to food, to house, to you name it. Isn't that so crazy that 47% of people believe that they're entitled to food, housing, and healthcare? Insane. Anyway, he said that crazy ass quote in the house of Mark Leader, head of Sun Capital, private equity firm, surrounded by a bunch of people from private equity. So that's the type of message that is surrounding these people. Like, that's what's driving these guys.
So as always, Ariel's the one on this show who actually understands these things on a technical level. So at the end of Plunder, the Ballou talks about like a lot of reforms we can make. A lot of the industries that private equity is attracted to kind of seem to be industries where we need reform anyway. Like, we should have staffing minimums at nursing homes. Like, we need massive prison reform. And then there was also like some legislation that he was promoting.
Yeah, so there's like regulatory decisions that are specific to how private equity works, to how it's supervised, how it's investigated and overseen, and then Congress's role in that as well. I will say, like, if you liked this episode and you would like to learn more about private equity, all the sources we had are great, but Plunder is an amazing place to start. And one of the reasons I love it is he really does have a very, very chunky chapter at the end that is extremely explicit with all of the ways that we could stop this from happening. So some of the regulatory suggestions he makes: private equity should be required to disclose the fees that they collect to their investors. So that would be like in the example of the $10 of taxpayer money that's going to ambulances. Like, basically anybody who's investing with private equity should have a transparent understanding of like, hey, for every $10, what percentage of those $10 are going straight into fees? Because fees does not translate into a return for the investors, right? So like, investors have a right to know that. And that's a normal part of fiduciary duty. It's just not getting applied fairly to private equity. So like, again, part of this is that we need to actually enforce some of the regulation that already exists. Another suggestion is to prohibit incentive-based pay for private equity firms that do shady gray area shit like dividend recapitalization, mass layoffs, pension abandonment. Basically, you shouldn't be able to get yourself a bonus by laying off thousands of people without any severance and then like no consequences for you personally. Like, not only do they not have consequences, they're actually incentivized to do that. So we should get rid of that. And then like, we should designate private equity as systemically important. This one's a double-edged sword. Like I said, 14% of large banks' loan commitments are to private equity. I do think we need to designate them as systemically important. They are of the size that the housing market was in 2008. Like, we've seen this show before. We know what happens.
And we could do a whole other episode on private credit. But essentially, a lot of these private equity firms are like also involved in the buying and selling of debt, the issuance of loans, and they have none of the regulations that large financial institutions like banks have. So like a lot of the same trends that created the financial crisis are being seen again in the private equity and private credit space.
And it's like the same fucking people too. If you designate them as systemically important, like the double-edged sword there is that they also get a bailout when they fail, and they will fail and they will get bailed out. I feel like it's more important to designate them as systemically important because you do get more transparency when they're designated that way. And honestly, I think tomorrow, if private equity fell, they'd still get fucking bailed out. So
let's be real. If they failed, they would fully get bailed out.
Yeah, they're going to get bailed out.
So.
Well, there's no consequences for these people. Now, one thing I really did like at the end of Ballou's book, he does explicitly call out that like individual activism actually does have a really big part to play here. So he gives some examples. Coalition building is really important. We've talked about that like when we talked about Cory Doctorow's book, Enshittification, and how he talks about how the repair, like people advocating for right to repair have done a really great job building coalitions all around. You know, there was a wheelchair repair group, there was a electronics repair group, and by getting them all together, they had a lot more power. And you can do that with all of these industries that are already fucked, that are getting more fucked by private equity. So like there are already activists who work every day for reform around payday lending, around prisons, around nursing homes, around hospitals. Connect them, put them together, build a coalition. So like if you're an activist in one of those spaces, you should absolutely be looking for other people who are negatively affected by private equity. Another thing activists can do is publish explanations of how private equity affects their area of concern. Because of arbitration agreements, there is less available casework on which people can draw to try to fight back on private equity with their legal grounds. Make it public. Make all the information that you have public. He also talks about participating in the legislative comment processes. Like we said, there's a part of your congressperson's job is to figure out what is important to their constituents. So like participate in your legislative comment process if you want to reach out to your legislators and let them know, hey, fuck private equity, get them the fuck out of my 401k. Also, activists can power more creative creative lawsuits in a way that government regulators can't. So like government regulators will sue on behalf of the government. It gives you slightly different grounds than if you did like a civil suit. Basically, activists could work with investors or former employees of private equity firms to sue the firms for breach of fiduciary duty. And then also just convincing investors to push back, like the pension fund push that the former Toys R Us employees did was really successful. So trying to figure out who is investing in private equity that is reachable in some way, who has normal people involved in making decisions, who is small enough that they could make movements that have actual impact on the private equity firms. So investors are like arguably the only people who have leverage here. And then finally, I'll just say like Ballou says that he worked in the Department of Justice during Trump's first term when there was the Muslim ban and he was trying to end the ban. That's what he was working on. He ultimately left the DOJ instead. But he said every single morning there were protesters in front of his building. And this is a direct quote. He said, "The literal protests in the street gave me, a junior lawyer in a quiet office, the strength to make my complaints to more senior and more powerful people." So keep protesting. It really does matter.
And maybe we'll see you in the streets.
Maybe we will see you in the streets. The streets are calling one way or another.
And you know what else is calling?
I was totally going to have you do it. So that's perfect. That was aggressive. That was a good one.
It's been a brutal couple episodes talking about some very depressing things. So should we go Falcon Mode?
Hell yeah.
Okay, so Falcon Mode is our listener-submitted segment where we take a listener-submitted idea or a problem and we chat about how to make it more useful, feasible, or fundable. So Ariel, today we have a Falcon Mode from listener Matt who says, "Every time I pass a field of crops while driving, I wish there was a giant sign telling me what's growing in the field. You drive by too fast to use a regular plant identification app. Is there a Shazam for crops?" Shazam for crops? That's sounding Quaker adjacent.
That is actually very Quaker adjacent. As a person who's just like perpetually nosy, I think this is really interesting. There's an easy way to do this that probably won't work in terms of like sustainable product.
Great.
There's a harder way that probably would work. And then neither one of them is particularly monetizable, which does not mean that you shouldn't make this. It just means I can't think of a way to monetize this. But I also don't think it's very expensive to make. So they're both ways to make this are like functionally quite cheap. It's just one requires a little bit more technical prowess than the other. The easy way, Google Lens API is free for the first 1,000 images. And then even if you were to get to like 10,000 images, it's not particularly cost prohibitive. I think it's like $200 to $300 for like 10,000 images a month. If you had like a user generated content app, if you're trying to populate a map and like you can rely on people taking a photo up close and using Google Lens to identify what the crop is and then just like saving it in the map, that's a way to do it. Couple problems with that. Matt, as you said in your original suggestion, you cannot get a good photo at 65 miles per hour. So this would rely on either like people who are curious enough to actually pull over and take a picture of it, or on people who were like passing it on foot or whatever. And then also like good luck identifying plants. I think that Google Lens and also a lot of the naturalist apps to identify plants are also being run through Google Lens API, but I think it's not perfect in terms of identifying the difference between crops. Crops are not as distinct as like flowers are. So,
and I've been saying that.
Josh has been saying that. Like sorghum from a distance looks like corn, and up close sorghum looks like millet.
Right?
And Josh, you say that all the time. Yeah, obviously you knew that. So this might not be like the best way, but in theory, it could work. The harder, better way that's also more like technically interesting. Crops are regulated, and we love regulated stuff because A, it's better for us, and also it's more interesting and easy to build with because regulated means standardized. So if it's regulated, we know what's out there. The U.S. Department of Agriculture actually spends a considerable effort mapping all the crops that exist and who owns them. There is a publicly available data set called the Cropland Data Layer. It is free to use. It has an openly accessible API. They do an annual survey by satellite. It's 95% accurate, and it'll tell you what's this crop, who owns this crop, like what is the name of this farm. It'll tell you what crops have been in this field before. So some crops will get rotated in different parcels. Will have different crops over the years. It keeps the soil better. It avoids monoculture. And then they can also tell you what the typical harvest on the crop is. So like if they know where they're at and what the crop is, they can tell you when the corn will be ready, essentially. And so that's a much better access point. And then you could just build an interface to let people access the cropland data layer. I think it would be really cool for Google to have like a biome layer. I hike a lot and I'm constantly like, is this chaparral or is it desert? Which California biome am I in right now with these like pointy little shrubs? I don't know. And this could answer that. But like I said, this is not like super monetizable. I think there could be some really interesting educational use cases. 4-H and FFA, Future Farmers of America. Like there's, especially in rural America, there is like tons and tons of, young people who are learning the skills of farming and who are learning crop identification and do all kinds of science to make sure that our nation can stay fed. But it also like shouldn't be very expensive to operate. So if somebody did want to make this for people who are just like nosy while driving, like Matt and I are, then it shouldn't be that difficult to make. So I think it's a great idea. I would totally use it. I love it. And if you have a similar idea of something that either could be a problem, could be solved with tech, or interesting app you would like to make, you can reach out to us on most social media at actuallyusefulpod, or you can email us at heyactuallyuseful@gmail.com. We love to hear from our listeners.
And we recorded this a month ago, so we hope that this country still exists after our 250th anniversary.
Yeah, exactly. Good point.
Bye.
All right, bye. Actually Useful is part of the Industry Plant Podcast Network. It's co-hosted and created by Ariel Butters and co-hosted, produced, and edited by Josh Stretton Carlson. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to our Substack or YouTube, or give us a follow on most social media platforms at Actually Useful Pod.